you want to?
I'll just try to speak up. I don't project very well, but I'll try my best. I got a call from Jim Brantley a little while ago, and Mike Dixon passed about 12:30 this morning. So we just want to make sure everyone knows that Bob Dixon passed away this morning. They don't have the arrangements set yet, but it'll be coming. So let's just start with a prayer. Just remember the family.
Let me repeat that since I have a mic. He was just passing on to everybody who didn't know that Bob Dixon passed away about 12:30 last night. There are no arrangements yet, but that will be communicated when we have them. Go ahead and pray.
Lord, thank you for your blessings. Thank you for the life of Bob. Thank you for Joan. Lord, they're an institution, and they're workers, Lord. They have always loved you, they've always served you, and they've worked in the kingdom tirelessly. Lord, I just want to say that I want to give you all the praise, honor, and glory for the life of Bob and his legacy. And I want to thank you that he has a reward in heaven and that he is in paradise right at this time. Lord, we're thankful for the hope that we have when the saints die. And we have that hope that we know that they're in a better place and that they're in your arms, in the loving arms of Jesus. Thank you for Bob and Joan, and bless their family and be with them and comfort them. Be with Mark, be with Michael, and be with Jonda, and be with Joan. Comfort her. Be with all their extended family, the many cousins that they have here, that you'll bless them, the Brantleys and the Snells, and Lord, they're such an important part of this congregation. We grieve at his passing. We just pray that you will be with them. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, John. This morning, we're going to take a look at the story of Job. Moving back to chronological order after last week's little Easter story, we're going to look at Job today. And again, like with a lot of these stories, it's such a big body of words that we can't get through all of it. Certainly can't get through reading the whole thing at all. But let's start just by testing our knowledge a little bit. If there's a word that you've heard to describe Job, what is that word? Job is suffering? Patient. So my question is, yes, Job suffered, but is Job really patient? People talk about have the patience of Job, but I don't know that this dude is patient. He's perplexed. Yeah, there's a lot of labels we could assign to him, but I've always been a little dubious of the patient one. When I read, because it doesn't take very long before he seems to express his impatience with everything. So we know the story. Is there anybody in here that is not familiar with the general outline of the book of Job, at least? That this is a man who suffered greatly, and then his friends were stupid and talked to him instead of just remaining sitting with him. Like, they did great until they opened their mouths, right? And then they have all these series of debates that goes on for chapters and chapters and chapters and chapters and chapters. And then God shows up out of a whirlwind and says to Job, "Who do you think you are?" And then at the end of the story, Job gets stuff back. More than what he had before, right? That's kind of the general story. I missed some details, obviously. But are there any other highlights or high points or things that you think I need to emphasize before I move on? Frank? Yeah, and the question why is never answered in this book. What is answered is that God shows up, right? You know, like Job has a lot of questions. Why does this happen? It seems like, but God shows up. I don't even know that why is really the question that is asked, though. I think that's the natural question that we want answered. But Job kind of implies why, but he just starts right in more than with why, with a claim that God is unjust.
I won't say much because if I do, when I say what I say, you'll know why I'm going to shut up. One of my favorite proverbs is, even the fool is thought to be wise until he speaks. And that, you see that when everybody opens their mouth, that they're kind of like, they don't know the whole picture.
Yeah, those fools in Proverbs, they make a lot of messes of their lives, and his friends may be fools, for sure. Yeah.
He wasn't patient, but he persevered.
He did persevere. I think that's a good point, is that in all of this suffering, he persevered. So let's dive in a little bit. We kind of know this story, obviously, but it begins, there once was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God and stayed away from evil. All right, that's a pretty good introduction as things go. It's interesting, though. There once was a man from the land of Uz. That intro is telling us that this is something that happened long ago in a galaxy far away, almost, right? Well, maybe not in a galaxy far away, but long ago. Once upon a time, there are people who will say that they think Job is more of a fictional morality tale than it is something that actually happened. And either way, I don't think that matters for what we get from the text. It's included in Scripture. Again, it is something that is meant to teach us whether, and I don't know that the veracity of Job or the truths expressed in Job depend upon its veracity, depend upon whether it is an actual historical event or not. I just don't think it does. But it's presented in a way with this opening line that says this did happen a long time ago. That also raises people's questions about when was the book written. Was it pulling material from a long time ago, or was it written really late? Some of the start and end language is very different from the language inside the book. Some of it seems much older, but some people claim it only seems much older. They're trying to make it sound old. Again, does it matter? I don't know that all that background stuff matters for this book. What we do have is a long work that teaches us a lot of things. And the way we have it is what we have to deal with. And that's just kind of an approach I have to most of Scripture anymore, is that this is what we have. Let's deal with what's in front of us instead of worrying about some of those. They can provide some enlightenment. Some of those questions that come up about things like that, I think that they're worth studying. They can provide some enlightenment, but in the end, you still have this text in front of you. So we have this man named Job, who is a man of complete integrity and blameless, who feared God and stayed away from evil. And that does sound a lot like Proverbs 2. John, you brought it up, so I'll keep talking about it. But this is considered wisdom literature. It's considered in the same vein in some way as Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, that it's lumped in with those other two books, that it tells us something about how we live our lives in a world that is uncertain, in a world that doesn't always make sense. And Job, one of the main things it does is it pushes back against actually some of the Proverbs, or some of what we want to look at when we look at Proverbs. And Proverbs seems to say, if you do this good thing, then good things will happen to you. And I know that's not every proverb, and that's not the entirety of the book of Proverbs, but Proverbs seems to say, if you do good, good things will happen to you, and if you're foolish and evil, then bad things will happen to you, except for when the wicked prosper and stuff like that, which does happen. But Proverbs has kind of a general positive attitude towards the correlation between our behaviors and the results. But Job pushes back on that, and he says, Job's blameless, and righteous before God. He does everything he's supposed to do. And what happens to Job? The worst stuff possible, the worst stuff imaginable happens to him. Because that's the way life works sometimes. And so I think it's kind of a, they're kind of throttling back. There went the Bible. They're kind of throttling back on the Proverbs approach to life and saying, look here, let's read Job and step back from that generally positive outlook that things go well. Let's step back from that. If that makes sense. Job is not a happy book by any stretch of the imagination. It is not a happy book at all. There's a lot of really bad stuff that happens, and a lot of really depressing conversations happen between Job and his friends. I want this one. I have two Bibles in front of me, and which one do I want? So, we have an introduction to Job, and then he has 7 sons and 3 daughters and a whole lot of livestock and wealth in general. And Job's sons prepare feasts in their homes, and Job's afraid they're going to sin. So Job is righteous not just for himself, he's righteous for his sons and daughters, I guess we could say it that way. He gets up early in the morning and offers a burnt offering for each of them. If only it worked that way, right? That struck me as a little weird. I'm going to do everything righteous, but I'm also going to do this. I wish I could do things on behalf of my kids that way, but I don't know. Many of you in here are parents or have been. I mean, your kids are grown, maybe. Can you get your kids to do right? Can you cover for the things your kids do wrong? No. As much as you want to. I mean, I want to protect my kids even still, as many of you do. But it's interesting, I think, that Job offers these sacrifices. That's not cultural for us. Yeah, man. It is a parental thing. Is this the same as praying for them? It almost seems like there's a superstition happening here, where Job is saying, "Hey, let's cover their sins." I don't know how that works in Job's understanding of religion and the rest of the book. Oh.
I think there is a difference between how God interacts with us now versus when he interacted with them. And I think possibly one of them is that God would bless the whole family through that person. And their descendants ended up being blessed. So maybe that's why he was continuing to ask for prayers for his children.
Yeah, and I do think that is a perspective that we lose a little bit. We have highly individualized the Bible. And I don't know that it's any different necessarily today. We know people who, because of just being a good person and a faithful person, that their life and their example is a blessing to the rest of their family. And yet we'll say, oh, they did so good, but the reality is maybe God is working through them, and we should view that as God's blessing. We still see, and we could say, is it the punishment for generations, or is it the, my sermon this morning is called Natural Consequences. When somebody does something bad, and then their kids suffer and grandkids, and it becomes systemic in their family, is that a curse? I mean, is that just brokenness? I mean, it could be both. But I think that we still see that kind of generational blessing and cursing happening some today in some way. And it's certainly a perspective that Job had, that he could do something as the patriarch, as the head of the family, that would be a blessing to his children and maybe help keep them right with God. Maybe that's the way of looking at it. And whether that's true or not, because there is certainly an individual decision and rightness that has to happen for our relationship with God, Job seems to fall very much on the side that he has some responsibility to do whatever he can for those kids. And I can respect that. So we're introduced to him and how righteous he is and how much he cares for his family, worries for them that in their parties that they're throwing, they might have cursed God in their hearts, is what he says. And this was his regular practice. But then it dives into the weird stuff. One day the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. Where have you come from? The Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, I've been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He's the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You've always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You've made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is, but reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. All right, you may test him, the Lord said to Satan. Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. And one day, when Job's sons and daughters were feasting at the oldest brother's house, a messenger arrived at Job's home with this news. Your oxen were plowing with the donkeys feeding beside them. When the Sabaeans raided us, they stole all the animals and killed all the farm hands. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another messenger arrived with this news. The fire of God has fallen from heaven and burned up your sheep and all the shepherds. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, a third messenger arrived with his news. 3 bands of Chaldean raiders have stolen your camels and killed your servants. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger. At this point, what are you thinking when you see another messenger coming from the distance? Another messenger arrived with this news. Your sons and daughters were feasting in their oldest brother's home. Suddenly, a powerful wind swept in from the wilderness and hit the house on all sides. The house collapsed, and all your children are dead. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you. Job stood up and tore his robe in grief. Then he shaved his head and fell to the ground to worship. He said, I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin by blaming God. I think sometimes we gloss over the horror of this. Job deeply cared for his children. He thought he could offer sacrifices to protect them. He thought he would do everything he could to keep them safe. And there seems to be this perspective that again, the book of Job pushes back against, not the person of Job, but he does too. But the book of Job pushes back against of this, you do good and good things will happen to you. God will protect you, God will bless you, and so on and so forth. And it pushes back against that prosperity gospel, as we call it today a lot of times. And it's not the way things work. It's not always the way things work. But Job cared deeply for his kids, and he thought he could do something on their behalf, and now that's been taken away from him. I don't think Job would care a bit about, he probably cared, I like to think Job cared about the people, the shepherds, the people watching his flocks, but I kind of suspect it would have been devastating in some way to him to lose the camels and the sheep and everything else, but none of that is like losing your children. And what's his response? He worships.
He praised God.
How in the world, in that situation, could you worship? Well, we know. We know that. We know because we've done it. We've been in the midst of grief. Many of us have been in the midst of grief and turned to God and worshiped. And there's still a connection to God. Do you think Job's response would have been worship had he not been praying on behalf of his kids and himself and offering sacrifices and been the righteous man that he was before that?
And he also realized who the giver was. It wasn't him that did it, it was God.
Yeah, God gave him all those blessings. I still suspect that there's some broken Job inside. But he knows that God is ultimately in control in some way, but it still doesn't make his life any easier.
How much harder would it be if he turned on God?
Yeah, if you turned on God. Fred Craddock he's a preacher, has a lot of preacher stories, and he tells one story about a woman that he visited in the hospital, and how she just didn't know how to cope with this illness that she was facing and all the challenges of it. And he said he looked over to the hospital table that's there, a little L-shaped thing that slides under the bed, and it's filled with, lip gloss and all the glamour magazines, and he didn't name names of these magazines, but it was fashion magazines and celebrity gossip rags and all that stuff, and that's what she filled her life with. And he muses, I wonder if she would have been better prepared to cope with the challenges of her day if instead of filling all the days of her life with that stuff, if she had filled it a little more with God. Because our preparation in good times, the time we spend is valuable for the bad times. The time we spend now with God is valuable for when the bad times come, when the darkness comes. That's what we see with Job, is that all his devotion had some benefit to him. His initial response was to worship.
But on the outside, did he not demonstrate how broken and empty he
Yeah.
was by shaving his head and
He does all these outward signs. Yeah.
in the dust? He took on that picture of where he was. He was devastated and empty and broken, and with nowhere to go except he turned to God and worshipped, but he was still in
Yeah.
the depths, as bad as he could be. And he demonstrated that by his posture and his look. You see that in biblical examples.
We can be complicated people, right? We can have more than one feeling at once, and those feelings and responses and instincts can be contradictory, because that's who we are. We could be like, I'm gonna worship God because that's my habit, that's what I've been conditioned to do, but I'm gonna mourn, and I'm gonna grieve, and I'm gonna weep, and I'm gonna shave my head and do all, and we can do things that seem like they don't fit together, because that our lives are confusing, and sometimes both those responses are what's needed. I'm going to worship God, but I'm going to do it while I'm in sackcloth and ashes, right?
I think David did the same thing when his child died, and he said, I will return to him, I will see him again. So maybe that's what he thought, that he'll see his children again.
Yeah, and the idea of afterlife maybe brought some comfort to him. That's a complicated issue in the Old Testament, I suppose.
I think sometimes we have a connotation of worship and joy together,
Yeah.
but that is not always true. And if you look at some of the old things like a requiem, which is a way of worship where you're remembering and mourning and lamenting, it's still worship. So because it's still putting God in the place where He is.
Lament is a lost art. I've had a conversation with Bruce a couple times, Bruce Oakley, about how we don't mourn very well in this country, in this culture. It's just not, we want people to hurry up and move on. And our employers will give us, a day for the husband of a spouse and 3 days for one of our parents. Maybe a week for a kid. But I don't know what your HR policies are at places you've worked, but you don't get over death that quickly and get back to work. There's definitely variations in different regions of this country, but I know even in the South, the mourning is not the same as what it once was. There's no longer the widows wearing black for a certain period of time and things like that, and the outward signs. It's just not done. But that's worship. It can be. There's there's a book about funerals written by a preacher, and it's kind of a pushback against a book by N.T. Wright as well, but it's called Accompany Them with Singing. And it talks about the last duty or the last service we get to do on behalf of someone who's passed away. And he uses that idea of we accompany them with singing. We gather together and worship our God in the time of death. And we get to accompany them to their final resting place with singing. And that's kind of a beautiful idea, a beautiful image. Funerals, in my approach to them, funerals are worship. They should be a worship service. It's not a worship service where I like to offer an invitation. I've heard that before. I always cringe at that a little bit. That's not appropriate. But it is nevertheless a time of worship, I think. Should be. Yeah.
What was the last word in the title of that book?
Accompany them with singing. Singing. La 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 la. Singing. Yeah. So, Job is in mourning, and that is worship. He is offering this statement of worship, but then we shift to the second trial of Job. Kind of like the first, only worse. Satan shows up again. I thought about diving into this whole heavenly council bit and the Satan, but I'm not gonna. If you have questions that you really want to talk about that, let's sit over a cup of coffee. Come make an appointment or something, because it's too much to get into, I think, for a Sunday school class like this. It is weird though, and it's worth looking at. It's worth considering what is the role of Satan here. What does it mean God sitting in his heavenly throne room in heavenly court? But we're in that vision of that place once again in chapter 2, and Satan's out patrolling the earth, and it's kind of interesting, God here, have you noticed my servant Job? Look how proud, what a proud papa he is, right? Have you noticed my servant Job? He's the finest man in all the earth. He's blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. And he has maintained his integrity, even though you urged me to harm him without cause. So, that's a word that shows up a couple times here. It's not patience, it's integrity. Maybe that's what we should talk about in regards to Job. Job is a man of integrity. He believes in God, and he's going to continue to worship God no matter what. That's what I think integrity means here. That Job maintains his relationship with God. So now Satan's like, sure, yeah, but you let me take away all this stuff. You never let me harm him. If it were his personal body, it would be a little bit different. So God says, okay, you just can't kill him, but do whatever you want to him as well. And he does. Satan left the Lord's presence. He struck Job with terrible boils from head to foot. And Job scraped his skin with a piece of broken pottery in verse 8 as he sat among the ashes. And his wife said to him, are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die. But Job replied, you talk like a foolish woman. Should we accept only good things from the hand of God and never anything bad? So in all this, Job said nothing wrong. Job is set up as this paragon of integrity, that he's not going to waver from his devotion to God. His wife's kind of introduced as a shrew. That's not a commentary on women, it's just his wife. And she comes in, he's like, just like, seriously, Job? Like, why are you still hanging on to this idea of your God? Clearly, if he is there, he's abandoned you. Just curse him and die. Just get on with it, Job. Just die. That's not very loving and kind. It's not a very well-rounded character here, but I don't think my wife would ever say that to me. Ever. And when 3 of Job's friends heard of the tragedy he had suffered, they got together and traveled from their homes to comfort and console him. Their names were Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. When they saw Job from a distance, they scarcely recognized him. Wailing loudly, they tore their robes and threw dust into the air over their heads to show their grief. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and nights. No one said a word to Job, for they saw that his suffering was too great for words. They sat with him for 7 days and nights. What a display of friendship. You know, our practice of mourning and funerals, you know, anymore you've got the visitation for an hour or two and the funeral right after, and so you only have to take out, even if you go to the graveside, it may be half a day's work that you have to take off to go sit with a friend in their grief. How much support do you need when your children die? Is 7 days enough? I appreciate the example of his friends here, though. They're just present with him. They're there to support him. They're there to be with him. At first. We know the rest of the story. But they sit there and wait until Job's ready. And then Job speaks. At last Job spoke, and he cursed the day of his birth. I think that's a key turning point in the book. Job curses the day of his birth, and he said, "Let the day of my birth be erased, and the night I was conceived. Let that day be turned to darkness, let it be lost even to God on high, and let no light shine on it." I am not alone in thinking this. I wrote a paper on Job's curse in grad school, and I am as convinced as I will be about something in the Bible, 99% sure, that Job is reflecting back on Genesis 1 in his curse. And his language is pulling from the idea of the darkness, and out of the darkness there's light. And by the end of the book, God creates humanity, or by the end of the chapter, God creates human beings on the 6th day. Well, what's the first thing Job says? I want to get rid of the day I was born, but not just the day I was conceived. I don't wish I were created. I want to be uncreated. And I want things to be darkness instead of light. Job is saying, God, you made a mistake in creating this world like this. This isn't just a woe is me statement. Job is trying to invoke some, as a prayer, or some would say incantation, but not in the sense of magic spell, but that's how it's been categorized here. But Job's saying, look, this world stinks and you shouldn't have made it, God. Creation was a mistake. It'd be better if everything were just darkness. That's what his statement is. Is Job still blameless and a man of integrity? In all this, he did not question God, but it sure seems like he is now. Job, in my understanding at any rate, again, that I'm 99% sure of, and you can disagree with me, but in my understanding of what he is saying here, Job has lost the moral high ground that he attempts to hold on to for the rest of the book. When I came to that understanding, it gave me a little more sympathy for Job's friends, but not much. They still mess up by opening their mouths. But he does. He curses the day of his birth. Let that night be blotted off the calendar, never again to be counted among the days of the year. Verse 9, let the morning stars remain dark. Let it hope for light, but in vain. It may never see the morning light. Curse that day for failing to shut my mother's womb, for letting me be born to see all this trouble. Had I died at birth, in verse 13, I would now be at peace. I would be asleep and at rest. verse 26. I have no peace, no quietness, I have no rest, only trouble comes. Grief does strange things to us. Grief alters us. It will alter our brain chemistry and our physiology in the midst of grief. It'll alter our response to the things in our life. It does things mentally, emotionally, and spiritually to us that unless we've walked through grief, we will never understand it. And we can never understand each other's grief because we all experience it differently. That's what makes it so hard. There are some similarities. We go through the stages and steps of grieving, but everybody experiences grief differently. And if you grieve more than one time in your life, as most of us will, each of those times of grief will be experienced differently. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to how do you grieve and how do you cope with a situation that leads you into that. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. And that's one of the things that the book of Job is trying to address, I think, is the difficulty of grief in general, that it's just hard. And our best efforts, this is where my sympathy to the friends come in, our best efforts aren't going to be good. Any effort that we make is usually going to be the wrong thing to do or say, unfortunately. The best thing we can do is just be present, be with people. I think that's the lesson that we learn, but anything else we do is going to be inadequate. It's going to be problematic. So Job curses the day of his birth in chapter 4. One of the friends does open his mouth. Eliphaz, the Temanite, replied to Job, "Will you be patient and let me say a word?" Shut up, Job. For who could keep from speaking out? Oh, you've offended me. Who cares? Job is grieving. Be offended, man. Suck it up, buttercup. Right? In the past, you've encouraged many people. You've strengthened those who were weak. Your words have supported those who were failing. You encouraged. But now when trouble strikes, you lose heart. You're terrified when it touches you. Doesn't your reverence for God give you confidence? Doesn't your life of integrity give you hope? I'm going to stop him right there. Again, in the midst of grief, there is a sense that, and this is one of the things I get from Psalms, for those who go to Heart Still Growing, is that the Psalms address all of the different experiences of the human condition, and they show us that even in times where we want to accuse God and scream at God like Job does here, that the very fact that we're talking to him should be a statement of our faith. Because if I really wanted to give up on him, if Job really wanted to give up on him, he wouldn't be talking to him anymore. And I do think that he's saying, I can't do this, but he's calling out to God, destroy this broken creation in his curse. And so he makes that statement as a prayer to God. Destroy the day of my birth, God, because it's unjust. I think it's a statement of worship even then, in some way, even still.
You know, I think even today, when we experience things and we're confused about why certain things are happening, sometimes I think we're afraid to take it to God and say, you know, be a little upset about it, about what's happened to our lives. But you know, God's bigger than that.
Yeah.
A lot bigger.
God is so much bigger than whatever's going on in our life. And he's also bigger than anything that we want to accuse him of. And that's kind of the point of Job, too. That he does go down that path of putting God on trial. That's really what happens later on. But that's the question. Is God just in this book? Is this right? Was it right that God let Satan do all this to Job? Some find comfort in that suggestion that this is not an historical account. Instead, it's a parable meant to teach a lesson. It's a really long parable that some have approached and said, well, that's not really how God would act. again, I don't know how much that informs this, but I think that it's an interesting approach, again, that can tell us something about this if we do approach it that way, that we are meant to draw some lessons from this. And what they are, God shows up. Again, we said that once. But no matter what, I'm still not satisfied. Can I say that? No matter what happens in this, I'm still not satisfied. So what God shows up? So what? God gave back all of Job's possessions and more, and he got a new family. Can a new family replace the family that was taken from him? No. We kind of read the end of the story, and I've just skipped ahead a whole lot and skipped over a bunch of notes because we're going to run out of time. It's a big story. It's a big book. But the end of this is not, and they lived happily ever after, is it? It's kind of presented that way, that Job gets all this stuff back. But we know Job by that point in the book, after we read, 20 more chapters. All the way to chapter 42. Right, it's 42? Yeah. We know Job well enough to know that there's a part of him that's still sitting with a shaved head in the ashes, I suspect. The things that he has at the end of the book cannot replace the things that he lost at the beginning of the book. And that thought makes me uncomfortable with the book as a whole sometimes, but it's the reality of it. And that's our human reality, and I think that if we neglect to put ourselves in Job's shoes at the end of the book, knowing him from the beginning of the book, and say he's got to still be hurting, and even though he had that encounter with God, when God came and spoke to him out of the whirlwind and said, look, you can't comprehend and understand everything about me. I also think in those speeches from God out of the whirlwind that he makes a concession to Job a couple of times about his justice and maybe, just maybe, that Job is absolutely right to say this world is broken, because it is. As much as we want to look at the fourth friend that shows up and kind of moralizes everything, I don't know that God says he's right in the end. I think it says, Job, you were absolutely right to say this world is broken. Where he went wrong was to accuse God of the evil in the world. The world is absolutely broken, and it's a place filled with hurting and suffering. And I don't know what to do with the book of Job sometimes. Because I sure wish, like Job, that God, maybe not like Job cursing the day of his birth, but I sure wish God would just fix it right now. Right? Like, how much longer does evil have to exist? How much longer does death have to exist? I mean, we celebrated, like last week, right? The victory over... How much longer does this stuff have to go on? And I take comfort in the fact that Job took the brunt of God's confrontation with humanity for me, because I have some of the same questions he has, and I suspect he still had them at the end of the book. And if I can't sit with a story like Job and say it makes me uncomfortable, I haven't grown up past the little kids' Bible stories. Because the reality is, Bible stories will make us uncomfortable. Bible stories make us confront the reality of the human condition. They make us confront the grief and the mourning and the pain and the suffering and the loss of this life and say sometimes it doesn't make sense that God doesn't do something about it. The classic problem of theodicy. If God is all-powerful and all-knowing, and he knows about evil and suffering, and he knows about them, and he's all-powerful enough to do something about them, why doesn't he? And there's, all the responses of free will and all the different things that are offered in philosophical discussions about that, and they all ring hollow. at the end of it when you're in the midst of it. And if we can't admit that, I think we're going to find in the long run that our faith and our understanding of God is weaker than we would like it to be. I don't have all the answers. I never will. I just won't. I do know one day God will show up. Last word, John.
The way Job ends is, I think, a positive note. I think it shows that Job is a struggler. He was a broken man who had a false worldview. He thought that he trusted in his own righteousness. He thought his righteousness would be enough to make him be able to stand before God. He longed for all the things that would make him righteous, even though he thought he could earn it. He longed for an advocate. He longed for a mediator. He was a struggler. But at the end, he continues to learn. He missed his family. He grieved for his kids that he lost. But he had other kids. And the last verse says that Job gave his daughters an equal inheritance. He did something no one else did, that people in that culture did not do. He honored his daughters equally the way he honored his sons. And so he was a man who continued to learn, continued to look at the world different, because everything he knew was challenged. And so he approached going forward as a much different man. And so he continued to learn, and as we go forward, we think, okay, we've got the gospel, we've got Jesus, so now we know everything, but we don't. We still don't know. We still see everything through a glass
Yes.
darkly, however James said it. And there's so much we don't know. We get a little more, we get a little bit of glimpses of things are happening behind the scenes, and that there's evil, and it's a broken world, and life is a struggle. But God is good, and God is going to, He is a Redeemer, and there is eternal life, and there is something beyond this, and we don't have to trust in our righteousness, because God's provided a way. And all of that is in Job. It's just, it's an amazing book.
Let's keep seeking, let's keep relying on God, right? He's there. Yeah. All right. Oh, I thought I was done. I'm done, Dad. All right.
I was going to say that for hundreds of years the Jews said, "How long, God?" And Jesus came. And for hundreds of years Christians said, "How long, God?" And Jesus will come.
Yeah.
I'm done.
All right. Be blessed.